There came a moment when an empire seemed to exhale softly, almost tenderly, and did not yet recognize what that calm concealed. On the Palatine Hill, where marble held the day's heat long after sunset, an aging ruler once wrote to himself about duty and impermanence. Marcus Aurelius, stoic, soldier, philosopher, set his thoughts down with a discipline as steady as any legion's march. His words survived because they were never meant to impress. They were meant to restrain. Not far away, beneath the same Roman sky, another figure later stood where restraint thinned to a performance. In the Colosseum, under a sun that bleached stone and skin alike. His sun-faced sand darkened by countless spectacles and the roar of a crowd, trained by generations to confuse cruelty with grandeur. The air carried sweat, dust, and the animal musk of beasts hauled from distant provinces in cages. A lion's roar rose like a challenge, and the city demanded more than a ruler. It demanded a god. He offered one himself. What followed was not merely the record of an emperor who governed poorly. It became a tragedy of inherited decay, the kind that arrived when a system built to magnify authority placed that authority in hands that craved adoration more than order. Rome's power had not been undone by a single foreign army at its gates. It had been bent inward, warped by appetite, until even applause sounded like pressure building in stone. Beneath the cheers, the empire began to crack. Rome at its height did not look fragile. It looked eternal, and that appearance was part of its strength. Across the Mediterranean, the sea functioned as a Roman road, patrolled and taxed, stitched together by ports where merchants bargained in Latin, and soldiers listened for trouble in every accent. In the north, legions held the forests at spear's length. In the east, Roman borders pressed up against the old powers of Parthia and the shifting kingdoms beyond. Roads did not merely connect cities. They bound distant provinces to Rome with stone, law, and the expectation that Rome's reach would arrive before disorder did. Peace was not an abstract slogan to most people who lived within this world. It had taste and weight. It could be felt in grain rations that arrived because administrators counted sacks and ship captains feared imperial punishment more than storms. It could be measured in olive oil and wine shipped so reliably that hunger often felt like personal misfortune rather than an inevitable season. Predictability was not paradise, but it was the first luxury of order. Even money carried a kind of promise. The denarius, still central to the empire's exchanges, retained a respectable core of silver in the age of Marcus Aurelius, less pure than in earlier centuries, but stable enough that commerce continued without constant suspicion. The empire's wealth did not rest on faith alone. It rested on metal, on accounting, on the belief that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to plan a life. Yet, even at the peak, Rome remained a ladder with steep rungs, and the climb bred envy as reliably as it bred ambition. At the top stood the senatorial class, men with old names and old estates, trained to speak of virtue as though it were a family inheritance. Many believed they embodied Rome's dignity. Even after the Republic's powers had been absorbed into emperors, they still gathered in the Senate House, still framed decisions in the language of tradition, still imagined that certain boundaries would hold because they always had. At the bottom, and often in the shadow of the amphitheater, stood figures Rome both despised and depended upon. The lanista, the trainer and dealer who bought fighters, fed them, and sold their suffering as entertainment, represented the blunt truth that Rome's leisure could be brutal even when its laws were proud. The city's moral language called such men vile. Its appetite made them necessary. Rome could be noble in the morning and merciless by afternoon, sometimes without noticing the contradiction. Religion, too, had shifted beneath Roman feet. Jupiter still reigned in ceremony. Mars still wore armor in the imagination. Venus still smiled from statues and coins. But the age of emperors had taught Rome a new kind of worship, the cult of the ruler. A living man could be declared sacred. A dead man could be deified. Politics and religion thinned into each other until the boundary was almost transparent. Once an empire grew accustomed to worshipping power, power eventually learned to demand worship, and the boy who would press himself into that thin boundary was already growing inside the palace, hearing Rome's noise like a lullaby and a warning. Commodus entered the world in 100, born into the imperial household at a time when that fact alone carried destiny. Rome called such births in the purple. Many earlier emperors had fought their way to the throne through civil war, adoption, or the dangerous lottery of military acclaim. Commodus did not need to seize power. He only needed to outlive childhood and stand in the right place when his father's strength finally failed. Marcus Aurelius tried to give him defenses against the corruptions that came with such a life. Tutors were summoned, minds meant to shape Latin into law and Greek into reason, men trained to speak of moderation and discipline as though virtue could be taught like geometry. The boy heard that a ruler should govern his passions as a general governed troops, but instruction was only seed. It did not take root in every soil. Commodus grew up in rooms where beauty and danger could coexist. He watched men bow with perfect smiles and speak differently when they believed themselves unheard. He learned early that affection could be a kind of currency, and that fear often purchased more than love. He absorbed the palace's lesson that power did not merely rule, it performed. He also learned something quieter and more damaging. His father's presence often came from a distance. Marcus Aurelius spent long years on the Danube frontier, where cold mud swallowed sandals and warbands tested Rome's strength. The emperor fought not for glory but for necessity, burdened by plague, pressure on the borders, and the relentless obligation of holding an enormous system together. His duty kept him away from Rome's warm corridors and away from his son. For Commodus, duty could resemble abandonment. An absence could become a wound that flattery was eager to fill. In that space, favorites rose. A chamberlain named Sauterus came close to the young prince, and closeness in the palace had political meaning, whether or not it was intended. Sauterus was not of Rome's old nobility, and that alone was enough to sour many senators. Whispers moved through marble corridors that the air was being shaped by attendants rather than statesmen, by indulgence rather than discipline, by the comforts of private life rather than the demands of public rule. Refusal became rare around him. Every small desire granted quickly became a lesson that wanting was the same as deserving. Tutors could recite virtue, but a palace could offer adoration, and adoration could feel like truth. Rome did not yet know it was raising a ruler who had never learned to want what Rome needed. Soon the emperor would return from war not with triumph, but with illness on his breath, and the heir would inherit an empire like a weapon already loaded. The last days of Marcus Aurelius were not gilded. They were grim, and the setting itself carried symbolism. Rome could never admit aloud, in Vindobona, near the Danube, the emperor lay surrounded by soldiers rather than senators, the air damp, the camp thick with smoke, leather, and the fatigue of men who had marched too far and slept too little. A philosopher fading in a military tent seemed to compress Rome's greatness and its coercive power into one image. Duty was not an abstraction there. It was cold and it hurt. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180, something steadier than any individual policy seemed to falter. The legions mourned. The Senate praised. The people, many of whom had never seen him, felt safer simply knowing such a man existed. He had represented restraint in a system that always tempted excess. Then the gaze of the empire moved to Commodus. At first, hope survived because hope was what exhausted societies reached for. Commodus was young, handsome, unmistakably imperial, and his father's reputation cast light over him like a borrowed cloak. The imperial household had long trained Rome to accept dynastic succession as stability, but the frontier demanded discipline, and Commodus demanded relief. He looked at the Germanic campaigns endless, muddy, cold, and he did not see Rome's necessary labor. He saw inconvenience. He made peace quickly, abandoning the patient, grinding strategy his father had pursued. Ancient sources differed on details and motives, but the overall impression remained. Rome's effort ended, not with a decisive settlement, but with a young emperor turning away from hardship toward Italy's warmth. The legions watched him leave with the baffled silence of men asked to keep paying a price for an outcome that felt unfinished. Back in Rome, the city received him like a returning son. There were celebrations, games, the rituals that reminded the populace who fed them and who could punish them. Commodus learned quickly that the crowd's loyalty could be cultivated, not only with policy, but with spectacle. A pleased mob was an instrument, and instruments could be played. Then came the first serious shock to his sense of safety. His sister Lucilla, once an empress herself and widow of Lucius Vir, became associated with a conspiracy against him. The plot failed. It did not merely threaten his position, it poisoned his perception. Afterward, compliments sounded like traps, laughter like mockery, and the Senate's traditions like thin masks worn by enemies. Whether the danger had been broader or narrower than later narratives claimed, the result inside Commodus was unmistakable. Suspicion hardened into instinct. Cassius Dio, the senator and historian who lived through these years, later depicted Commodus as a man who delighted in intimidation and mistook fear for loyalty. Dio wrote from within a class Commodus often despised, and that perspective carried its own bias. Yet even allowing for hostility, the pattern of paranoia and reprisals emerged in multiple accounts. Fear, once invited into a palace, did not leave quietly. It rearranged the entire household. Commodus did not respond to betrayal by growing wiser. He responded by growing convinced that survival proved entitlement, and entitlement proved he could do anything. What he wanted most was not merely to rule. It was to be adored as legend, to be treated as something beyond ordinary judgment. He presented it as a new age. Too many Romans with long memories. It felt like a fever dream that had learned to wear a crown. Commodus began to rename the world as if naming could make it obey. He renamed Rome itself Colonia, Comorgiana, as though the city that had conquered nations had become his personal possession. He renamed months after his own titles and virtues, pressing his image into the calendar so that time itself seemed to bow. The gesture was not administrative. It was devotional, and it demanded that the empire participate in his self-regard. He did not want to be first among men. He wanted to be beyond men. So, he stepped toward the arena. The Colosseum was a stone mouth that swallowed sound and returned it as thunder. Beneath its arches, torchlight flickered against damp walls. Straw and animal waste mingled with the residue of years of staged violence. The imprint of countless performances presented as civic routine. Rome had long used games to display imperial generosity and to manage a restless population with distraction. Commodus chose something more dangerous. He inserted himself as the central act. When he appeared, he did not dress as a modest prince. He dressed as myth. A lion-skin cape lay over his shoulders. A club was carried like a scepter. The image invoked Hercules, the strong man who had endured labors and achieved divinity, a figure whose strength could be celebrated without the complications of law. Cassius Dio described the spectacle with disgust, an emperor entering not merely as patron but as performer, demanding applause not for governance but for domination. Commodus did not face equals in the way tradition imagined heroic combat. Accounts emphasized that his opponents were selected to protect him, weakened or instructed. The outcome managed so that the emperor could appear invincible with minimal risk. The arena became less a test of courage than a theater of power. He personally dispatched exotic animals in enormous numbers as purges, lions, leopards, sometimes from a controlled position with projectiles. Even when danger was carefully managed, the message was unmistakable. He held the power of life and punishment in his hands, and Rome was required to celebrate the display. Cheering was no longer only enthusiasm. It became insurance. A face that failed to look pleased could be remembered later. The crowd participated because Rome had long been trained to equate spectacle with civic unity, and because, under an emperor who performed as a god, indifference could resemble disloyalty. The humiliation reached upward as well. Senators, seated in their prescribed places, watched their own status turned into props. Dio reported that Commodus compelled them to respond with acclamations that tasted of submission, as though the old guardians of Roman dignity had been reduced to a chorus. In public, their mouths formed praise. In private, resentment curdled into fear. Every appearance consumed money, lavish games, imported beasts, distributions to the people, payments meant to secure the loyalty of soldiers and guards. The treasury drained quietly at first, then less quietly. When expense outgrew honest income, the empire reached for familiar tricks. Coinage was debased further. Silver content reduced so that more could be minted from the same stores of precious metal. Such change rarely arrived with a proclamation. It arrived as a slow erosion of trust. Value watered down and expected to hold. Bread and spectacle Rome's bargain with its populace became more costly each season. To keep the city docile, Commodus fed its hunger for entertainment. To sustain entertainment, he consumed the empire's reserves. The age did not end with a single decisive battle. It began to unravel with applause that demanded more and more excess to sound convincing. Behind that applause, in the palace's perfumed chambers, another hunger group writhed, insatiable, and ready to consume anyone close enough to touch the throne. At night, the palace became its own enclosed world, lit by oil lamps and guarded by steel. thick with incense that could not fully disguise rot. Ancient writers described Commodus's court as swollen with indulgence. They circulated reports of extensive sexual exploitation and coerced intimacy within the imperial household, presented in some accounts with lurid numbers and sensational detail that could not always be verified. Even cautious readings, however, agreed on the broader pattern. Commodus treated desire as another instrument of hierarchy, and closeness as another arena where submission mattered more than consent. Court life followed the same logic as the games. Banquets piled food in waves, and laughter could turn dangerous if the emperor's expression changed. Those around him learned to study his moods the way sailors studied the sky, because a wrong glance could become an accusation and a well-timed compliment could become a promotion. The difference between favor and ruin narrowed, until it was almost invisible. In the midst of this stood Marcia. Marcia was his mistress, but her significance extended beyond the bedchamber. She had access that generals and senators lacked, able at times to soften him, redirect him, or shield others from his attention. Sources also connected her to sympathy for Christians, a risky association in a court where suspicion could be fatal and where the state alternated between neglect and targeted crackdowns against that growing minority. Through her influence, some Christians reportedly received brief reprieve. Her presence suggested that even within the most traditional symbols of imperial power, older loyalties and newer faiths could coexist uneasily. Around Commodus, men rose and fell with dizzying speed, and their ascent revealed the machinery that had begun to rot. A powerful official, described as stern and capable, became a focal point of resentment and fear, his authority provoking enemies until he fell when the army turned against him. Clender, once a slave, rose to control access to the emperor and influence the Praetorian Guard. Ancient accounts accused him of selling offices, converting governance into a market where posts went to the highest bidder and the state's dignity became a price tag. Whether every charge was fair or inflated by outrage, the practical effect was visible. Legitimacy was treated as something that could be purchased, and public service was treated as profit. This was not merely moral decline, it was administrative danger. When offices were traded, competence became optional. When the guards learned they could shape succession, security became a negotiation. Commodus drifted farther from any reality that contradicted his desires. He was surrounded by flatterers because flatterers survived. He became isolated from plain speech because plain speech was punished. The Senate's anger turned silent because speaking could become a fatal risk, and silence only deepened the emperor's conviction that no opposition remained worth fearing. He was not merely ruling Rome now, he was playing Rome, and the game demanded that everyone else accept the rules. That as his performances multiplied, his sense of himself swelled beyond politics. The gods were no longer patrons to honor, they were rivals to surpass. That belief drove him toward an act so public, so insulting to tradition, that even those who had endured years of humiliation began to treat mere survival as a form of resistance. New Year's Day approached in 193, and with it, a plan that made even seasoned courtiers feel the floor shift beneath them. Commodus intended to lead the procession of the consuls, not in the dignified robes of state, but dressed as a gladiator. It was not a private costume, it was a statement. The highest officers of Rome would march behind a man who had turned governance into performance, as though the state itself existed to validate his persona. To Commodus, the gesture promised triumph. To those around him, it threatened catastrophe. It risked provoking the Senate beyond endurance, humiliating traditions that still anchored legitimacy, and alarming soldiers who expected an emperor to embody authority, not parody it. In a system already strained, a public affront could become a spark. In the palace the air thickened with a specific kind of fear, the kind that did not shout because walls listened. Rumor moved faster than certainty. Faces stayed calm while thoughts raced. Then a list appeared. Marcia discovered names marked for arrest and execution, written with the casual finality of a man ordering dinner. Her own name was among them. In that moment, affection became irrelevant. The emperor's favor, once a shield, became a trap closing. Marcia did not act in isolation. Palaces did not permit solitary plots for long. Others who recognized their own danger aligned with her. Men who understood that if Commodus remained in power, dawn could bring a wave of officially sanctioned violence. They chose a method familiar to court intrigue: poison, a weapon meant to remove an emperor without public uproar. That night, it was administered with his food. It was meant to end the crisis quietly. It did not resolve matters cleanly. Commodus became severely ill, and the conspirators watched time slip away. Their plan had turned into a half-open door that could slam shut on their hands. A failed attempt carried its own terror, because survival would not produce gratitude. It would produce vengeance. They turned to a final instrument, Narcissus. Narcissus was a wrestler, a man whose strength had been honed for contests of control. He was summoned into the bath chamber, a place of steam and marble where the boundary between emperor and man could blur. Commodus, weakened yet still dangerous, remained capable of turning the machinery of punishment on anyone within reach if he recovered enough to give the order. Accounts described a brief, close struggle. In the confusion of the bathhouse, Narcissus overpowered Commodus and ended his life by force. The act had none of the clean distance of a blade, none of the theatricality Commodus had always preferred. There were no cheering crowds, no arranged opponents, no scheduled applause. There was only a swift, private conclusion to a reign that had insisted on public worship. Rome did not hear his final moments. It registered the absence later, like a chord snapped in darkness. And with that snap, the Golden House did not become quiet. It became unstable, because the removal of a dangerous ruler did not always bring immediate relief. Sometimes it opened the gates of chaos. Commodus died at the edge of a new century, and with him died the comforting illusion that Rome's stability was permanent by nature. His reign did not instantly collapse the empire. Rome did not burn that night. Walls did not crumble in the morning. The machinery of administration continued. Taxes were collected, soldiers drilled, ships carried grain. Yet something essential had been damaged: the belief that power would be exercised with restraint, that institutions could outlast the moods of the man who stood above them. In the wake of Commodus came the year of the 5 emperors in 193, a grim sequence of claimants and contests that exposed how much authority had drifted into the hands of armed men. Pertinax rose and fell. Didius Julianus became infamous for purchasing imperial power from the Praetorian Guard. Pescennius Niger and Clodius Albinus contended as rivals. Septimius Severus emerged ultimately victorious. The rapid turnover was not merely political theatre. It was a symptom of systemic fracture, made visible in the open. Rome itself seemed degraded by the spectacle, treated as a prize to be bid upon and seized. The Guard learned, more clearly than ever, that it could make and break emperors. Generals learned that legitimacy could be claimed at the head of loyal troops. Senators learned that dignity without force was only language. Commodus had widened the distance between emperor and institution until the state struggled to pretend it was anything other than a personal possession. He had demonstrated that a ruler could treat the empire like an arena, replacing governance with performance. He had nourished habits of bribery and patronage within the Praetorian Guard and court. He had helped accelerate financial pressures that encouraged further debasement and distrust. These patterns did not alone create the later crisis of the 3rd century, whose causes were multiple and contested, involving external threats, internal succession struggles, economic strain, and shifting military realities, but his reign fit into a longer process of stress, and it offered a vivid example of how quickly imperial authority could become both absolute and unstable. The question of Commodus himself remained debated even in antiquity. Ancient sources, especially senatorial voices like Cassius Dio, depicted him as a monster who delighted in humiliation and state violence, an emperor from hell. That portrait carried class hostility and political grievance, and historians approached it with caution, yet even allowing for bias, the evidence of erratic rule, public self-deification, harsh reprisals, and corrosive favoritism remained difficult to dismiss. Whether Commodus was born unfit or formed by the palace was less important than what the system permitted. Rome had created a structure where the emperor's personality could become national fate. One man's vanity could reorder calendars. One man's suspicion could trigger executions. One man's hunger for applause could drain treasuries and bend institutions toward spectacle. Rome survived Commodus the way a body survived a toxin, alive, but altered, and not fully certain what damage would surface later. The lingering question was not only how he fell, but why so many people had been compelled to perform belief in his divinity until a private act of palace violence became, to them, the only remaining remedy. Marcus Aurelius wrote that fame was smoke, that power was temporary, That mortality came for emperors, as for beggars. His meditations were private discipline, words meant to restrain the self. They were never intended as prophecy, yet their contrast with what followed became hard to ignore. The philosopher-emperor endured cold campaigns on the Danube so Rome might remain stable. His son turned stability into a stage and mistook the crowd's hunger for meaning. In the Colosseum, sand absorbed the cost of spectacle and gave nothing back. Torchlight flickered under the arches. The crowd roared because the empire had trained it to roar. Commodus appeared draped in a lion's skin, lifting his arms as if the world could be held up by applause and held together by fear. For a time, the chant answered him. For a time, the calendar carried his titles. For a time, Rome performed belief because disbelief was dangerous. But the world proved heavier than the noise that praised it. In a bath chamber, stripped of costume and ceremony, the emperor who claimed divinity met an ordinary human end, away from the stage he had built. The conclusion came without spectacle, and the irony remained sharp. A ruler who had lived for public worship disappeared into silence. The tragedy was not only that Commodus fell, it was that a fortress of order built by Marcus Aurelius had contained, within its own bloodline, the key that opened the gate. Rome's greatness had always depended on discipline as much as conquest. When discipline turned into performance, power remained immense, but it became unmored. Long after the cheers faded, the stones of the amphitheater kept their scars. In the quiet that followed centuries later, it was possible to imagine the old sounds returning, the distant chant, the clash of iron, the animal cries dissolving into human celebration. Beneath them lingered another echo, the hollow space where an empire had once mistaken a man's appetite for destiny. The ghost that remained was not only Commodus's, it was Rome's, the reminder that when power demanded worship, it eventually required more than obedience. It required belief, and belief, once coerced, never stayed pure for long.